Chapter 8 is all about the central nervous system, which is why we might wonder sometimes, or sing along, if I only had a brain. So let's take a look at Dixon. Dixon is an auto mechanic. He's 42 years old, and he comes into the ER complaining about the absolute worst headache he's ever had. And as he's complaining about it, he vomits, loses consciousness, his blood pressure is through the roof, his heart is racing, his breathing though is slow, and his pupils are strangely dilated. So the doctor decides to order a CT scan. The results of that CT scan show a subdural hematoma. That's this right here, just below the dura mater, in the brain. There's some bleeding. The hematoma means there's some bleeding. So that blood now is pushing in on the brain. It's crushing it between the cranium, the skull, and the softer nervous brain tissue. So let's look at some of the parts of the nervous system and kind of see how the nervous system is broken down or laid out. To start with, we have the whole nervous system, which we can divide into two parts. The central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, 90% of your nerves are in the brain or spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system, that's all the other nerves all over the rest of your body. This peripheral nervous system we can break down into two parts. The somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system are basically your five senses. The autonomic nervous system is what automatically takes over whenever you're in a fight or flight situation, or whenever the body's just normally taking care of itself. We can divide the autonomic nervous system into two. The sympathetic is just that system that's trying to prepare your body for stress. It's sympathizing with you. It's the fight or flight. So when you're ready to jump off a cliff, that's your sympathetic nervous system trying to prepare you for whatever may come so that you're most likely to survive. The parasympathetic nervous system is your rest and digest. So after you have that heart racing moment, it's what gets your body settled back down to normal. Parasympathetic. Your brain, part of your central nervous system, is protected by these four major things. So four major things protect your central nervous system, particularly your brain. You have first this bone. So in this case, your cranium or skull is protecting your brain, but also your vertebral column protecting your spinal cord. So first we've got this bone layer that protects it. Then just beneath that bone layer we have a layer of fluid, cerebral spinal fluid. It floats your brain. It allows your brain to stay just kind of suspended in this fluid so that your brain isn't bumping up against the bone and injuring yourself that way. The other thing to consider is that your brain weighs about 3 pounds, and all that weight on the lower brain might crush that soft brain tissue. So again, by floating in this cerebral spinal fluid, it preserves the integrity of your brain. Then along the outside of the brain we have what are called meninges. So this fibrous kind of see-through tissue that protects your brain by surrounding it around the outside, meninges. And then D, we have something called the blood-brain barrier. That is, blood does not directly come into contact with the brain. Your blood carries all kinds of things, bacteria, viruses, colds included. Those things can't directly come in contact with the brain because of the blood-brain barrier. So the blood drops off oxygen and nutrients. It's going to pick up carbon dioxide and waste, but it's not going to contact the brain cells directly. So the blood-brain barrier. Now the benefit of that is it preserves, again, your brain and spinal cord from getting infections very easily. It also prevents your brain and spinal cord from getting medications that might be used to help combat things like Alzheimer's. So the blood-brain barrier does protect your brain in that way. Meninges are the surrounding tissue around your brain. Meningitis tells us there's an inflammation in the meninges. Now, typically, meningitis isn't such a big deal. It is kind of a big deal, especially on college campuses, but it's not a huge deal, except for one problem. Meningitis is the first step toward encephalitis. That would be more inflammation around the brain. In that case, it is a big deal. So, schools take a lot of effort, make a lot of effort, and take a lot of precautions to make sure that meningitis doesn't spread around or doesn't get to contaminate too many people, because it's a major problem if it inflames the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid is helpful for shock absorbance. Whenever you bang your head or conk it, your brain is floating in there. So rather than just smash up against the side of your skull, it's going to float around in the fluid there, which helps it move much slower. But it also provides things like the nourishment and waste removal, because that's what the blood's really interacting with. So let's match up some of these words with their descriptions. So here's some of the things that your brain and the protective layers are doing. Here's some descriptions of what they match up with. So let's take a look. So support. What there is going to most connect with support. So in this case, we're just going to connect it with A, floats the brain, keeping the brain suspended. Shock absorption, we're going to connect that with C, cushions impact. Waste removal, we're going to connect that with B, removing carbon dioxide. And supplying energy, we're going to connect that with supplying energy, because your cerebrospinal fluid does that, all those things for your brain. Now the nervous system consists of the central nervous system and what? In this case, we're going to say, oh yeah, the peripheral nervous system is the other major division. So central and peripheral, like on the side, peripheral. Which of the following does not protect the nervous system? So yes, 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 no. Cuticle is on your fingers. That has nothing to do with the nervous system. Which is not a function of cerebrospinal fluid. So we know it acts as a shock absorber. It helps support the brain. It nourishes the brain. It doesn't do much in the way of stimulating the brain. That's more the job of nerves. So let's look at some brain parts then. First, we're going to locate the cerebrum. That's going to be this part right here. The cerebrum. That's the highest part of the brain in function as well as location. It's like all folded up like a walnut. The folds and the wrinkles all have names that are sometimes very specific, but it allows a lot of surface area for those neurons and those synapses to transmit lots of information and store it. So it's the cerebrum, that's your thinking part. So when you're thinking about the thinker, and that thinker, that's the cerebrum, the thinking part, the cerebral, the highest part of the brain in terms of function as well as location. So let's take a look at some other brain parts besides just the cerebrum. That would be part A, that's the cerebrum, which also is involved in like understanding your senses, some motor function like moving body parts, as well as associating different things like how does it interpret or understand those movements. So that's A. The cerebellum is down here. That's going to be D, the cerebellum. That's going to be coordination and motor skill. The corpus callosum, this part that joins the brain up, that's going to be B, corpus callosum. The thalamus is going to be what's in charge of relaying information and processing a lot of the sensory things. So coming up from the spinal cord and into the brain, the thalamus I think of as like a relay center or like a switchboard operator. So that's going to be H, thalamus. Below the thalamus is G, hypo means below. The hypothalamus is going to be in charge of things like emotion, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, body temperature, just maintaining homeostasis, all those parts of your body that are vital. The midbrain, C, is going to direct information to the cerebrum. It's also going to be in charge of reflexes. Like when you hear a sound and your head automatically turns. That's your midbrain. The medulla is going to be E. So the upper part of the brainstem there, medulla, E. And the pons, where the cranial nerves are attached, that's F. So pons just means bridge. It's a bridge between the cranial nerves and the central nervous system. Your cerebrum is divided into two major halves, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. Now you might know or you might remember that the right hemisphere actually controls the left side of your body. The left hemisphere actually controls the right side of your body. These two hemispheres are divided by the longitudinal fissure. It goes right down the middle. It's a deep groove. It goes all the way down to the corpus callosum. So here you can see it here. So That's one hemisphere, that's the other. Here's this deep longitudinal fissure. Here's the corpus callosum that's joining those two halves together. Now if I slice the brain this way and look inside, I'll see some gray matter on the outside, white matter on the inside. That white matter is myelinated. That means the nerve impulses can travel much quicker. The gray matter is unmyelinated, which means that the nerve impulses travel much slower. But it's going to help, this corpus callosum is going to help communicate between the left side and the right side of the brain. So we were going to take a look at the cerebrum. We can divide it into 4 different lobes. A, here the red part, is the frontal lobe. It's in the front of the brain. C is in the back of the brain, the occipital lobe. So you might think of someone who said, oh, I've got eyes in the back of my head. Well, that's the occipital region. And the eyes are actually sending nerve impulses through the ocular nerve to the occipital region. So the occipital is in the back there. The temporal region here, D on the side, and the parietal region or lobe here, B at the top, a purple one. So frontal, occipital, temporal, parietal. So in this case, let's take a look at this subdural hematoma here at Dixon. Which lobe would be impacted? So take a look here. We would notice that it's most likely the frontal lobe is being impacted. We're also going to notice that if this is on the right-hand side of his body, that is actually the right-hand side of his brain, that is actually the left side of his body that's going to be impacted most. So which is the highest in location as well as function? That's going to be the cerebrum, the thinking part of your brain. When we take a closer look at your cerebrum, we can take a look at these bands that go along the outside of the cerebrum. Now one of them is going to be a sensory band, the other is going to be a motor band. But it goes around the outside of the cerebrum, and that's where a lot of your senses are going to be located and especially interpreted. So in this case, that sensory area, we can break it down into your 5 senses. So the visual area has a lot to do with interpreting what you're seeing, like understanding what is it that I'm seeing. The olfactory area has a lot to do with what I'm smelling. So I think of like an old factory. What am I smelling? Ooh, it's an old factory. It smells terrible. The auditory area has a lot to do with what you're hearing, pitch and rhythm. So singing bass, singing tenor. That change in pitch is interpreted by the auditory area, as well as rhythm. So you might have had a music teacher say something like a ta, ta, ti, ti, ta. Now follow that rhythm, and you think back. So understanding that pitch and rhythm has a lot to do with your auditory area. The gustatory area has to do with taste, like eating with gusto. I think of like eating with gusto. So I'm really enjoying it, but it has to do with taste. And then the primary somatosensory area has to do with the part of your brain that's dedicated to sensing touch. So the larger or more of your brain that's dedicated to sensing touch, the more sensitive those areas are, the more interpretation goes along with it. So for example, your lips are very sensitive. Lots of your brain is dedicated to it. You can feel very subtle things with your lips. Your hands are the same way. Your elbows, not so much. There's not much of the brain dedicated to it. So in this drawing, you can see that parts of the body are exaggerated because large parts of the brain are dedicated to sensing those things. So that's the primary somatosensory area. It has to do with touch and how sensitive those areas are. This is the primary motor area. So it's not just sensing. There's another band around the brain there, the cerebrum, that has to do with understanding moving and how you move in certain ways and how much dexterity you have, or like how precise those movements can be. So again, large parts, the parts that are exaggerated have large parts of the brain dedicated to them, like your hand, which is going to have lots of different movements. Again, your mouth and face going to have lots of the brain, lots of different movements, even your tongue. But here we have like your knee and your ankle, not so much because you don't have a lot of movement typically associated with those things. Not a lot of different ways it can move. That's the primary motor area, this voluntary movement. The premotor cortex is this area where we have learned motor skills and even a planned movement. So if you are learning how to move your hands across the piano, that has a lot to do with your premotor cortex, or maybe even learning how to tie your shoe. You go through that sequence of events to tie your shoe, you remember how to do that, your muscles remember how to do that, your hands move in that same way every time. That's the premotor cortex that's in charge of those kinds of things. You also have in your brain association areas. So you have the sensing, the motor, like what do I sense, then what can I do, and now like how do I put it together? Like how do I make sense of those things that I can see, or how do I make sense of these things that I can move? That's your association area. What do you think about what you're doing? All right, so here's how we analyze and act on it. So, for example, we might smell, oh, cookies, that's delicious. Or you might smell, oh, trash, that's disgusting. But whatever it is, like we interpret it here in our association areas. Like that's what makes a judgment of whether we see as pretty or whether what we see is ugly. The prefrontal cortex is part of the front of the brain, again on the outside of the brain, the cortex area. That has a lot to do with reasoning, planning, and abstract thought. So when we plan ahead, we're like, oh, what am I going to do this summer? All right, I've got these plans, I need to, and then we start making this plan make more sense. That's our prefrontal cortex. It also helps us to reason, all right? If A plus B equals C, and we go through these logic problems, that's our prefrontal cortex. Here are some other association areas. The somatosensory association area has to do with interpreting senses. So not just touch, but what does that touch feel like? Is that pleasant or is it painful? The visual area gets our colors and shapes, but the association area recognizes, oh yeah, that's a square, oh yeah, that's a circle. The auditory area picks up sounds and rhythms, but our association area tells us, oh yeah, I like that kind of music, or oh no, I really don't like that kind of music. This association areas that help us interpret or understand it. So Dixon's here at the hospital. The neurologist conducts a few more tests after this initial surgery. The bleed has put some pressure on the frontal cortex, and there's a high chance of a stroke. So a lot of times when the brain can't get the oxygen nutrients it needs, those cells start to die. That causes a stroke. In this case, we've got all this blood here that's pressuring the brain. The same thing can cause a stroke by preventing some blood supply getting actually to the brain tissues. Dixon's having trouble what to figure out next. So this has a lot to do with planning. Something's wrong with planning. Worse, he can hardly talk. So this has a lot to do with that motor control. So which part of Dixon's brain were not functioning correctly? So think back. What part has to do with figuring out what to do next, planning? What part has to do with the muscle movement involved, especially with talking and making words with your mouth? So think back to that and review it. The thalamus is sometimes referred to as the relay station. So this is going to direct motor activity and memory. So here we have H. It's going to relay messages from the lower part of the central nervous system to the higher parts, the brain where it can have more interpretive parts. The hypothalamus is going to maintain everything, it seems like. So the hypothalamus down here, G, that's going to maintain everything. Homeostasis especially, keeping everything the same. Blood pressure, heart rate, breathing rate, digestion, your body temperature, your hunger, your thirst. Why you get up at the same time every day and have to use the bathroom at the same time every day, your biorhythms, even your sex drive, and what you determine is pain or pleasure. The other major thing about the hypothalamus is that it regulates the pituitary gland. You might not think that's a big deal, except that the pituitary gland is a gland that controls almost all the other hormones. So it's a major deal in controlling all of the body's functions. So which part of the cerebrum is located in the posterior? That's the back of the body. In this case, that's going to be the occipital lobes in the back. The sensory area for taste is, so which of these has to do with taste? Oh yeah, gustatory, you're eating with gusto. The area of the brain that helps determine reasoning and personality. So here again, this is where we're doing some like reasoning, thinking, planning, like who we are and what we are. That's the prefrontal cortex. The cerebellum is this area in the back of the brain, D. The cerebellum has a lot to do with coordination and it has a lot to do with equilibrium. So if you ever got hit in the back of the head, that's why people go unconscious, because the cerebellum determines a lot of your coordination and balance. So whenever that's compromised, we've got some major problems. So here's a little activity to do to help illustrate what your cerebellum is all about. Take your middle fingers, stick them down at your side, and just raise them up over your head. You'll notice it's kind of hard to find them. But once you find them, lower your hands again and try it. This time you can do it almost perfectly without a whole lot of trouble. That's your cerebellum. Understanding that movement and coordinating it so that it makes sense and so that it goes well. So if you have a lot of style and grace, you think that's your cerebellum, all right? Moves you around the world gracefully. If you're kind of clumsy and a klutz, well, then you can blame it on your cerebellum. Your medulla oblongata is this lower part of your brain. So we've been kind of working our way down the brain here. The cerebrum, and then we looked at the hypothalamus and the thalamus, and now down here, the cerebellum, and here we're at the brainstem. So down here, the lower part of the brainstem, the medulla oblongata. Now that's going to have a lot to do with regulating your breathing, your heartbeat, your blood pressure, and it has this thing called the reticular activating system. It's the thing that keeps you alert. So your reticular activating system kind of keeps you alert. It's also the thing that tunes things out. So for example, you watch a Peanuts cartoon and you're listening to the adults are all wah, 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 because the kids are tuning them out. The reticular activating system tunes out things. So you might be really concentrating on one thing and you've got everything around you tuned out. That's the reticular activating system in operation. It's keeping everything tuned out. So as you go to sleep, it's your reticular activating system that's shutting things out so that your brain can finally rest and you can finally fall asleep. Your midbrain has a lot to do, that's the C here, it has a lot to do with simple reflexes to sight and sound. You see a flash and you turn. You hear a sound and you look. A cell phone rings and you've got to see what's going on. That's your midbrain. It's kind of simple reflexes that kind of make you look in those directions to sights and sounds. The pons, down here F, is the origin of the cranial nerves. There's 12 cranial nerves that go all over the face and the neck area and head. And it has a region that assists the medulla in respiration, making sure that you're breathing on time. So again, which part of the brain is going to control balance and coordination? That's the cerebellum. You might think, oh, you got your bell rung. You kind of dizzy and disoriented. The part of the brain that controls heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing rate, that's going to be your medulla. It's in charge of those things. When a cell phone rings, you automatically turn your head. That's going to be the midbrain. So let's look back here at Dixon then. Dixon's brain started to swell in reaction to the exposure of blood and the cerebral spinal fluid. This fluid was being drained, so we're trying to drain it in the emergency room. But the swelling's putting pressure on the lower parts of the brain. It's forcing the brain down into the skull area, which is hurting those things. So why would Dixon be placed on a ventilator? So a ventilator is going to be an apparatus that helps him breathe. So think back, what is it? What part of the brain has a lot to do with breathing? That's in the lower part of the brain. Why might his body temperature be fluctuating rapidly? So again, think back, what's going to control body temperature on the lower part of the brain, and what might be injured because the brain is being pushed down into his skull and that soft brain tissue is being damaged. The limbic system is not an organ, but it's several things together inside the brain that are working together, often responsible for emotions, forming memories, especially long and short-term memories. If you take a look here, you're going to see some of the things that are involved in the limbic system. The question is, why is smell related to memory? So let's look back here. Does anything have to do with smell? Oh, here's something. The olfactory bulb, olfactory has to do with smell. So here's something that's closely related to smell, that's part of the limbic system. So you might smell a smell and it brings back memories from a long time ago. It's because it's part of the limbic system and is connected deeply with your memory. The spinal cord goes straight down from the brain. It's about 18 centimeters long and it's encased in bone and then cerebral spinal fluid and meninges. And it's going to conduct the messages between the brain and the rest of the body. So all these nerves are feeding into the spinal cord and then it's being interpreted by the brain. It also serves as a reflex center. Sometimes sending a message all the way up the spinal cord to the brain just takes too long. So sometimes the message just goes to the spinal cord and then back. So like you touch a hot stove and you move your hand away right away, that's your reflexes. So here we have the stimulus, a pin, sending a message down this neuron, that's B, to here, this association neuron inside the spinal cord, and it's coming out here to a motor neuron, which is causing the muscle to retract and hopefully move away from that sharp object. So reflexes are just automatic responses. So which part of the brain is the highest in location as well as function? That's the cerebrum. The sensory area for taste, so eating with gusto, so gustatory area. The area of the brain that controls memory is going to be a whole system. So in this case, the limbic system. The part of the brain that keeps you alert, that's the reticular activating system. Which are spinal cord functions? Well, so the spinal cord is going to transmit messages, that's true. It's going to integrate and interpret some information, that's true. Which are the spinal cord functions? So mostly here what we're going to look at is transmit messages and reflexes. Even though the spinal cord can do some interpretation, it's not going to do it like your brain's going to do it. So this is going to be our best answer. Sorry, says the neurologist, but Dixon is dead. Is he still breathing? His sister was in tears. Well, yes, but he has no brain activity and cannot breathe or swallow on his own. Does he have a living will? The doctor asked. He wanted to be an organ donor, the sister replied, sadly. The question here is, would Dixon exhibit normal spinal reflexes? So if we were to tap his knee or like run our finger along his foot, would his toes curl in response? Would he have spinal reflexes? Even if his brain's not working, would his spinal reflexes be working? And damage to which area of the brain would prevent Dixon from waking up? So again, think back to the lower parts of the brain that are being squished into the skull. What part of that has to do with staying alert? And if that's physically being damaged, how might that affect Dixon's ability to even wake up?